believe we are live already.
Yes, we are live.
All right, wonderful. Cool. Hi, everyone. Welcome to NUDC 2021. We're very happy that we are back this year with the chain of events that would lead towards the national competitions in later in August. First and foremost, we'd just like to say massive congratulations for everybody who has managed to pass through the provincial selections. It was definitely not a tough feat because there were thousands of videos that were submitted as parts of your application. So it's a really great achievement already to make it to the nationals. So hopefully the nationals will be a great experience for you. In order to help with the experience of going into nationals, we're going to be sharing 2 seminars today, 3 actually. The first will be debating seminar, and then followed by adjudication seminar, and finally technical briefing. That will be very, very important in order to ensure that you can navigate through what is required for you in the chain of events of the national and UDC later in August, so that it can be as smooth as possible. The core adjudication panel for this year would be Akbar, Defi, Jane, myself, and Zudi. More on that later. So without further ado, let's start with the debating seminar. The one who's going to be conveying the seminar on debating would be myself and Defi. Later on, I'll pass it over to Defi as soon as the introduction finishes. And then later for the adjudication seminar, Zudi and Akbar will be delivering that. All right, first and foremost, why is the seminar important? It's important because in debating, you will be required to think critically about hot button local, regional, and global issues. Debating also helps you to approach information and perceptions critically, not taking what is told to you as is, so that we understand both sides of the coin. It is generally the device to help with critical thinking. However, it is worth noting that debating does not require you to change your identity or worldview. Number 2 is also about structure. In debating, you are required to convey your thoughts in a manner that answers the motion properly, that is within 7 minutes of a speech, that answers the rule of the game. All of this requires structure and discipline. Number 3, also because standards that is used to deliver speeches in debate continues to evolve. Standards in competitive debating is changing year by year, following new standards introduced and employed in World University Debating Championship and Asian BP every year. Of course, the finalists of NUDC will get some sort of scholarships from Pois in order to go to the world level. So hopefully, this can be in your favor when it comes to odds, but most importantly, that's why this seminar is important, just to ensure that every year NUDC is tailored so that it is as relevant as possible with the most recent trends in global debating. Hopefully there will be something new or two that you can learn from the seminar, even though it's classic debating seminar. Now, for those of you who are not necessarily as familiar with what is the core adjudication panel or CAP, it's known also as the adjudication core. We're the heads of adjudicators. We're going to be leading the tournament when it comes to executions. We're going to design the motions. We're going to brief participants, accredit and allocate judges, and standardize judging and scoring. We won't be responsible for the bureaucratic affairs, the legal backbones, decision made in and around the tournament, because this will be under the purview of the Ministry of Education and Culture under Pois. However, we will be managing much of the inputs on debating standardizations, topics, and adjudication for NUDC 2021. You are more than welcome to ask any of us at any time. We don't bite. We promise you that. We're nice people. So anytime you're welcome to ask us about matters pertaining to tournament contents. I'm a NUDC champion. Defi is a world's EFL semifinalist. Jane won IVED and Best Spoken in many tournaments, while Zudi and Akbar are Oxford IVSL champions and multiple time national champions and best speakers. So you have wonderful, wonderful people in the panel of adjudication core. What we will be discussing are as follows: 4 types of things under this debating seminar. First, we'll be discussing about theme and speaker roles. Number 2, about motion types and setting up. These will be the materials that Defi will be delivering to you. best practices and pitfalls, and technicalities and feedback last. So without further ado, I'm passing this over to Devi to describe team and speaker roles and so on.
Hello. I hope I'm audible. For now, is it clear? Okay, cool. Okay, for team and speaker roles in the section 1, I will give a brief explanations on what it is to expect and what to do and what not. And next. For format overview, since NUDC will be using a British parliamentary system in which that it will be consist of 4 teams in one chamber, that it will be consisted on both opening benches and also closing benches. Although that this might be seems like it's a 4-team format, it has to be paid into attention that just because that you are coming from the same bench, this not necessarily means that you will be cooperating with your closing bench. So you probably already half undergo it when you're going to the province elections and responding to videos that are existing. This is exactly how it will probably looks like. This is actually the speaking order that you will have to undergo. First, in opening government, you will have a prime minister and deputy prime ministers. Also in the closing half of the opening of the government bench, you will have member of government and also government whip. In the opposition bench, you will have a leader of oppositions in opening oppositions, and closing opposition have member of opposition and opposition whip. For the speaking order is exactly like it is attached in the video, that it will be started in prime ministers, leader of oppositions, deputy prime minister, deputy leader of oppositions, member of government, member of oppositions, government whip, and lastly oppositions whip. This is the format that we will be using. Next. For the general descriptions upon British parliamentary debate is that each speech is 7 minutes long. This means that we will have to stop you and taking notes at 7 minutes. We are going to strongly encourage you to time yourself using Debate Keeper, which is available in both iPhone and also Android format, or you can use any stopwatch necessary, anything, because it will be great if you can time yourself. Point of informations or POI are allowed to be taken between the 1st and 6 minutes, and each speaker must at least take 1 POI, and not taking POI means that your judge will see you as not engaging to any other team, as equal to as if you're not responding to any teams that are giving you POI. So we encourage you guys to give and also take POI for each teams. And all motions will be given in impromptu. It means that everyone will have a 15 minutes to prepare from all motions. So no online access is allowed because it will be considered as not good if you do it. And also for the judging system, it will be mostly decided based on logics, not based on the beauty of your speeches, or there's an English precision or factual loadedness. And for example, if we're not expecting you to have a perfect grammar, we are not going to expect you to have a very beautiful in terms of aesthetic speeches. And this is because this is not a speech or paper crafting contest. Judges will be considered as an average reasonable voters that mostly rely upon your explanations and step-by-step analysis on the logical sequences that you try to explain. To win the debate, basically, there will be 3 burdens that you have to answer. The first burden that you have to undergo is that logical burden itself. First that you have to do is to elaborate the likelihood and the impact of your claim. There are several tips that is used. That number 1 is that you have to prove that why your argument is true. Second, how you try to supplement the ideas with enough elaborations or factor that your major statement is solid and experienced. What are the impacts of your claim and why the statement is likely to happen? This is step-by-step analysis upon the elaborations of the likelihood is needed. For example, saying that academic tracking is bad because it makes less performing students far less confident is valued less than academic tracking is bad because number 1, subpar teachers will be allocated to less performing classes. Second, kids will be exposed to fellow students were not as encouraging in academic endeavors. 3, parents, especially in the context where academic are seen as important, will brand kids as a failure. And fourth, kids will internalize all of this, then they will become less confident. You can see that there's a differences upon the degree of analysis and also the likelihood step by step between of these two statements. Judges will most likely favor the second part of this rather than the first type because on how it shows that step-by-step analysis and much more grounded explanation in comparison to one-liner analysis that I given in the first statements. But for the second is that you have to make sure that the argument is motion-based. What does motion-based itself? It means that we address the key issues demanded by the motions. Are you actually discussing the idea that are expected and demanded by the motions? For example, upon the motions of this House believe that the media should not report the full horror of war. It's probably more of an explanation on what is the value of full horror itself. What are the consists and what are the impacts of the allowance of using the full horror of war to be reported and such, as opposed to discussing on the freedom of speech that the media should have, or even this government impositions and actually something along that line. Because this later will rest relevant when the motion was specifically worded upon the media should not report the full horror of war. So we should focus more upon what is the core idea that the motion expects you to use, as opposed to the implied analysis that you might need to take certain takes itself. For a meta debate itself, it's also important to be comparative. Comparative it means that you have to compare your teams with other team in itself. It's often in the debate, it's the term that we mostly use is framing. For British parliamentary format specifically, it requires you to prove that what makes you better than other team, why is your argument is better than somebody else, and why is your kind of argumentations after proven more important than someone else. It is also important to take a note that you are not only comparing yourself with your direct opposition bench, but you also have to compare it in case that you are closing team. You have to also compare it why you are better than your opening team. So you basically have to compare your team to any other three teams that is existing in that room in itself. Not enough for you to simply dismiss simply one team only, because judges have to see it in all aspects, in all debate that existing in that round. How to lose in debate in Italy, right? We already discussed on how to win. These were several key takes that we have to avoid if you want to win the particular round. First, if you made an irrelevant statement through the motions, for example, like what is mentioned in the previous time that are in the idea of horror of war. And second, there's an underdeveloped ideas that you are not elaborating it in a nice way and not long enough for us to take our analysis in itself. And last and the third is that for you unable to reverse responses, the common mistakes in the term of response that they think that by neutralizing or giving a one-liner responses of simple no is enough to create a responses in itself. That's not what is expected by judges in the term, right? You have to completely flip or totally neutralize it. Not enough by simply create a one-liner for that. And fourth is that unable to prove on why your team is better than other team. That's why it's important to be comparative. And in a close calls, when the debates are very tight, not taking a POI might significantly impact the decisions of the judges when we are trying to favor. For opening roles, that there are several things that have to take on. That start the most important issues of the debate is that you have to explain as solidly as possible. Second, there is no need for you to create a dictionary definitions. You can bring your own definitions in accordance with the motion. Remember to tailor it with the flow of the debate. If OGs, as an OG, model on how to run your policy is important, but it's not mandatory. There are several types of motions that might not require it, that will elaborate it later. If an opening opposition, you have to select your stances, whether you want to stick with the status quo with a certain degree of improvement, or a completely new counterfactual, or providing a counter model like what it is proposed unlike what it is proposed by the opening government. Also, it's important to take a POI from the closings to make sure that you are still relevant until the end of the debate. For closing team, you have to, number one, it need for you to have an extensions that are completely different than the idea that's coming from your opening team. Summarize the debate is actually needed. You have to summarize upon the debate and create a biased adjudication in favor of your closing team, as opposed to create a bench analysis. Try to defend closing government, for example, as opposed to government bench as a whole. Extension is something new from the closing team, and it could be anything. It could be in the form of new argument, new responses, new examples, and new way of saying things. The more meaningful the contribution is, the likely is for the closing team to win. And also, it could be another strategy is by filling the gap of explanation from your opening, but don't repeat what they say. You have to fill what they haven't said to complete the analysis. We can take the contribution from this as well. Take POI from your opening to be engaged to their cases. For the speaker role is the first opening, we have prime minister or leader of oppositions. There are several key differences. For example, in stance, what is the problem that made the motion arise? What would you like to do? Prime minister could come up with a model tailored specific with the motion. Leader of opposition can have the ability to choose whether they want to stick with the status quo or improve an improved status quo, or even a new counterfactual that try to denounce and reframe the analysis coming from OGs. For arguments, that you can start with what you believe the most important value or gain in this debate. And the motions of this house would invade Zimbabwe. Probably protections is the most important that you want to defend. In the motions that this house believes that an ideal democracy has a small number of political parties, you can probably argue that political streamlining has more value than electoral logistic in itself. If a leader of oppositions will probably, and the first thing that you should do is to provide the key responses to prime minister. For speaker roles, the deputies. For deputies team, that first role that you have to do is to strengthen your team by providing an additional argument to support or oppose the motions. Ideally, something that your earlier speaker hasn't said. An additional explanation to support your teammate explanation is also important. Make sure that it's still nuanced what you said and what your previous speaker said. And also for the second is that to provide the key responses. To provide key responses to the opposing team is a very important, as usually you are going to speak later than prime minister or such. It's important to give responses to LOs. Also, it's important to provide an extension to highlight a certain specific and unique contribution for your team. Sometimes that the things that the opening team has not talked or has touched briefly is the role of the member speakers, because you are probably the first person who speak from the closing half in the end of the day, right? You have to tell your judges why your contribution is the most meaningful contribution in this debate. It's important, it's more important rather than responding what the opening bench to be said. That's why we have to value your analysis, and your stances of a team is better than the opening benches. Also, to provide key responses is still necessary, especially if you're closing team, especially if your opening benches hasn't response towards a lot of you say that you more probably have to take several bullets that you have to give a responses to what your opening benches, or eventually you also have to give up key responses to what your direct opposition bench. So you have to give a responses to either team that are given.
Diffie, can I just add something really quickly on this?
Yeah, sure.
So on extensions, the reason why there is a line that says this is often more important than responding is this is a note for anyone who is becoming a member of the closing team. Yeah, that means speaking first for a closing team. Make sure you're not too lost in your responses and then ultimately not necessarily allocating enough time when it comes to developing your extensions. This happens a lot because responding is very exciting. Sometimes you spend 5 minutes to respond, and then ultimately the extension only has 1.5 minutes in the very end part of your speech. That would not be strategic, because then it makes you lose your opportunity to introduce something really, really meaningful for your bench. So just make sure you keep that in mind. It has to be a healthy proportion between responses and extension. And in a lot of times, you still have your whip to do to do responses. So even if you want to just have 1 point of response in member and then maybe allocate 6 minutes for the extension, if the extension is super important and super tricky to explain, so you need a lot of time, that's okay too. If you want to bring your extension first, your responses second, that is also okay. Sometimes some speakers do that. I want to bring my new material first. If I have time, I will respond later. That's completely valid as a strategy for members, so please play around.
All right, thank you, Kaupi, for the additions. And lastly, we have a speaker roles, which is good. Is that first we have to summarize the debate by creating an equally important with responses. But responses shall be structured in a way that summarize comparisons between your team and 3 others. It also needs to provide a biased adjudication as to why your team wins. The easiest to do it is by creating a comparison, for example, between closing government or closing opposition wins against opening government, against opening opposition, against your direct opponent team. This is usually needed. A strengthened extension is also needed, like what Kaupi already explained, by creating an additional explanation, factors, characterization, example for your teammates' extensions. Providing key response as well, to provide key and final responses to your opposing team. If closing government, you are the only speaker that able to respond to member of oppositions, and it's important to frame out your opponent team by itself. So, next, we are going to explain upon the motion types and upon setting up. First type of motion is that the analysis versus policies. For analysis motions, for example, this house believe that, this house support, or this house oppose, this is the simplest type of the motion. This type of motion usually asks you to assess whether the value of a certain item, occurrence, or object is more positive or negative from the perspective of a neutral observer. Usually, usually no need to explain the feasibility or logistical arguments, or usually referred as mechanisms. In the example type of this motion, or this house believe that the replacement of traditional shops by modern mini-marts bring more harm than good. It needs to take upon note upon that the debate should be whether or not the statement above is true. That, for example, that the replacement of traditional shops by modern mini-marts brings more harm. Is it significantly harmful, or it is not? It's not about banning dangerous zoos or something along that line. Where the merits of these actions outweigh the harm from a neutral observer point of view. Another example will be this house support breaking apart tech giant. It's also need to be characterized whether the existence of tech giant brings more harm or it brings more good. No need to necessarily explain the mechanization on how we try to breaking apart the tech giants in a much more detailed manner, since for example, something along that line. For the policy motions, for example, this house would ban modern mini-marts. Notice that this might have a similar nuance with the previous motion. However, in the motion of this house will ban, it requires an active action of banning a certain actors or certain entities in these cases. The actor of the parliamentary or Congress of the country will most likely going to make a policy and formulating methods on how we should ban the modern mini-marts. It's not necessarily on why does X brings more harm than good or otherwise, but more upon why the value achieved at a specific threshold enough to compel the actors to do something. Usually it requires a bit of modeling on how this will be done. It needs a characterization and also mechanizations on what needs to do and to be conducted for this part. For the next type of motion is the alternative universe, right? The alternative universe usually consists of 2 parts, a regrets type of motion and river. For the regrets, the key example is that, for example, we are regretting a certain actors or certain behavior that is existing in this era, and we want to create an alternative to a step. For example, is that this house regret the rise of NATO after the fall of the USSR. It is important that it's also required to describe What are the alternative world that will probably look like if NATO fall after directly in the USSR? So most likely than not, this is probably if one you have to compare what are the worlds that you envision to be and what are the worlds that we are currently living right now. And you have to evaluate in retrospect with the benefit of a hindsight, probably in the when you are actually explaining the comparison, you also have to think what does it will looks like right now if this never happened, something like that with the what existing in status quo as a comparison. For the prever motions that this house prever are usually referred as PHP. Example is that this house prever a world in which love is unfaltering. The oppositions cannot invent a new world to compare government world. They have to defend the status quo. For example, this house prefer a world in which love is unfaltering to a world where love is mercurial. You have to directly create a comparison, and you are not okay. It's not okay for opposition to create an alternative universe in which not existing in status quo, because it's the motion were pretty much straightforward that they have to prefer a world with A or a world with B, which is usually referred to what is existing in status quo and what is not, what is absent in status quo. So comparison is undeniable exists. That's why you should not run away with the burden that you should answer by itself. Next is the actor type of emotions. An actor motion is mean that you are going to act upon a certain actors, that you have to defend their interest, that you also have to think like they're actors in itself, right? Usually you have to be sympathetic toward the actors that you try to defend, because you have to understand what are their motives, what are their interests and such. For example, the motions as the Black community in the US, these also regret the use of violence in the BLM movement. So you are going to debating as a Black community in the United States. You're not going to debate it as a neutral person standpoint, but rather within the interest of the Black community. Is it usually you have to assume what are the interests of these actors and such. And also there's another type of motions that are using actors is that the soft actor motions. Usually the soft actor motion, it could be in the form of this house belief that X, it is within the interest of actor A. You have to prove like why it is within the interest of actor A to do it. Also, all arguments must be anchored to a specific interest, way of thinking, priorities, and needs of that particular actors. Everything else is not relevant. So you have to fit an understanding and understand what are the probable interests of the actors that you try to defend. Definitions. The definition that we will use in the motions that you should not bring a dictionary definitions. The adjudicator are supposed to be an average intelligent voters who will know what are the dictionary definitions of the term are. Only define in a specific way that help you to debate. Debates are not assumed to happen in Indonesia all the time or in a specific time or place, unless the motion were specifically said so. Assume that all debates are general debates that happen in a functional democracy. Do not make the debate more specific than what's indicated by the motions. Also, a definition can be challenged, and only if OG's definition is truistic. For example, we would invade the country X only when the invasion is perfectly done. Or even a squirrel, a creative interpretation, such as defining UMR as the right to get married, while that's not exactly the cases. Or it is a very unfair setting of time and place. For example, does the debate only about Vanuatu and not only other places? This type of definition will probably significantly unfair for the opposing team if you set it in a very tight setting. Only LO can challenge these definitions. And usually, it could get very messy. To avoid this all costs, please for teams who try to define, please use it under a very much reasonable definitions to avoid the debate going, very messy. That's why it's important to be paid attention, but did not negate the rights from the leader of opposition to deconstruct the definition that are by the opening government in case that it is really unfair for any teams later in the speakers. Next, we have fiat. Proposition fiat is, it's not a car. And yeah, it means that the motion has to be assumed that it has to pass, that there should not be an argument, there will not be enough support by the Congress to do it. You have to assume that it is possible for us to execute a certain motion with an equal amount of resource, with the resources, similar resources and such. Debate should assess the value of the action when it is done, not whether or not it's not feasible or something along that line. But but there's also an existence of counter proposal, counter-props. The opposition can propose a counter policy in order to achieve the same outcome as government teams. That is to say, usually you can assume as an opposition, you can assume that you have an equal amount of resources that opening government are trying to pull. This is actually exists. That's why it's okay for you to say that the proposal given by the government team might not be the best, but with equal amount of resources that opposition have, you can pull another type of policy or something along that line. The counter policy must be mutually exclusive, that in the doing of the counter policy alone must be better than doing either the governing policy alone, or both the government policies and the opposition's counter policies. A valid counter proposal use the same amount of riot, political will, resources, etc. as government proposals. Okay, I think I will give back to Kaupi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Devi, for the presentation on the first two sections. I'll be dealing with the final two sections. Let me just change my... hope I'm still audible. If I can get information, that'd be great. Sorry, this is still audible, right? Chat. Yes. All right. Fantastic. All right. Section 3 will discuss about best practices and pitfalls to avoid. So let's march on with this. The first thing is best practices. Number 1 is about arguments. How do you develop good arguments? It is worth noting in BP, first and foremost, principal arguments have the same or equal value or weight as pragmatic arguments. Now, if you want to develop good arguments, usually there's 4 things that you can do. A well-developed argument usually has 4 things. Number 1 is a clear premise or clear title. This is something that is isolated from other ideas. I'm going to use an example of military conscription here, supporting military conscription. This house would support military conscription, something like that. Yeah. For instance, the premise of the argument says military conscription is very effective to build a common national identity among those from different backgrounds. Notice that this premise should be separated with other benefits, like military conscription will give discipline. That's the second premise. And military conscription provides for better readiness to serve or defend in face of an attack or disaster. That's the third premise. A good argument usually separates idea 1, 2, and 3 so that it doesn't become mixed up. So that's the first trait or character of a good argument. Number 2, a well-developed argument has a lot of reasons or factors to support the idea, like what Devi has mentioned earlier about academic tracking. In military conscription, you probably want to give a lot of reasons as to why your premise is true. There's 5 reasons under this. Military conscription is effective to build common national identity because 5 reasons. 1, because military camps are centralized, so gathering cadets from different places and backgrounds means there's a lot of gathering of those from different backgrounds. Number 2, military training is grueling, allowing cadets to use same stories of hardship and experience to bond with each other and form friendships. Number 3, cadets join when young, where personalities and identities are still relatively malleable. Number 4, stories are shared because they have no one besides each other to talk to, so that they will be able to share their life experiences, allowing empathy and understanding to foster. And number 5, uniformity and discipline in the military inculcates the principle that the nation is above all. Personal identity markers should be secondary. Examples help, but not a must. But if you notice, there's so many reasons or factors to support the premise. So the more heavy all of those things support your premise, it usually indicates a well-developed argument. Number three, a good argument has a trait of making comparisons. For example, military conscription does all of the above more effectively than the counterfactual, which is informal education by parents or community, which has a lot of personal bias and little interaction with those outside of your own family or identity. Also, military conscription is better than schools, which are still relatively localized and low pressure when it comes to experience. Notice that in the first part, you only talk about military conscription. And then in this part, you make the comparison between military conscription and other things in the society, which is probably your opponent's arguments, right? When you start to make comparisons, your argument becomes better. So please make them. And finally, the fourth aspect is link back. Link back is generally an analysis to show why the argument matters. For instance, the final thing is, now that we have concluded we can build common national identity with military conscription, why is that important? A common national identity is important so that young persons are less likely to be influenced by sectarian or divisive identitarian influences, which is now very prevalent in the society. A common identity is one of the biggest crises in a democracy right now, thus should be valued higher than many other benefits in this debate. This is important because if other people say, oh, we have a benefit of budget, oh, we have the benefit of discipline, we have the benefit of readiness to serve or defend or facing the attack of disaster, you have this analysis, this part of your analysis that judges can refer back to and say, why are all of those other benefits more important than this analysis that is already provided by the speaker? That's why explicitly saying this helps your argument in order to make sure that your argument's position in the list of many arguments that may come in the debate remains high as a priority. That's why try as much as possible have these four factors in your arguments. Number two, on responses. It is very important to be responsive. So there are three types of responses. You can choose and mix and match wisely. You don't have to choose only one, you can choose two. The first one is negation, which can lead also to flipping. Negation structurally proves not just denying, but rather structurally giving a solid reason as to why the opponent's claims are false. In fact, the intended consequence is quite opposite. For instance, responding to the idea of common national identity will be derived from military conscription. Maybe a response that negates or flips would be something that says, it is not common national identity that we will get out of conscription, but rather a brainwashed elite group of people who believes that military is more important than other civilians. The education in the military is also immune from public inquiry or criticism. Hence, it tends to heavily favor the dominant nationalistic agenda or political narratives. That's why common national identity is wrong. The right one is military elitism and nationalistic agenda. That's why their argument is actually negated, right? That's the first type of response. Number two is mitigation. Mitigation proves why your opponent's impacts are not as great as they claim. So minimizing the impact, For instance, during military conscription, cliques usually form between those who speak similar regional languages or come from similar geographic background. If you're from Java, then usually you gather around with people from Java. If you're from Sumatra, you gather with people around from Sumatra. So maybe the idea of melting pot, common identity, all of those things is not as strong because you have these cliques that are forming. So probably you're not going to share experiences to people who come from different backgrounds than you, right? It mitigates the level of the benefit from your opponents to some degree, but probably not necessarily entirely gone. But it's enough to minimize the analysis coming from the opposition, And that's why the second type of response is very important. The third type of response is about trading off, or even if. This proves why even in your opponent's best case, your value is still more meaningful, i.e., even when common national identity is important, the value of free thought, free speech, and diversity is more important for democracy. So this is assuming all the common national identity is true, mitigation does not happen, negation does not happen, you still win because there's still a higher value. That's why it's very, very important to do trading off, to do even if, in order to establish hierarchies between opposing ideas. The other parts of responses is that all of the best practices for arguments you heard in the previous slide also applies here. Make sure you have a lot of factors in your responses. Make sure you are comparative, and make sure there's a link back. Most importantly, a good response is a direct response. You want to identify which premise of your opponent you'd like to tackle down, and then you break it apart, right? So for example, you'd say, military conscription builds common national identity. I think this is wrong because that's an example of a direct response that is clear as to what premise you want to debunk. Don't be too polite to your opponent. You're welcome to be much more straightforward when it comes to what point you're trying to respond to. In fact, that would really help you in order to make sure you fulfill your role in responses. Yeah. Now, on number 3, on points, what do I mean by points? I have talked earlier about arguments and responses. However, there is no inherent difference between arguments and responses. Usually we separate them in Indonesian debating, right? Well, there's part of a positive contribution, there's part of negative contribution, but inherently there is no difference between the two. You may experience as a debater that some of your arguments are directly oppositional to what is said by your opponent. Bearing the dual function, yeah, both it is your argument and your response. It is very common to find these situations. That's why there is absolutely no need to separate arguments and responses. You may integrate them whenever you feel that it's more strategic to do so. In fact, doing so can save you more time. Yeah. When you do this, you may want to allocate the time in the beginning of your speech to address things that you cannot integrate. And then when you integrate things, you flag where your argument is responsive during your explanation. So this would look like, in my speech, I will have 3 points to say. All of the rebuttals will be integrated with the arguments. So let's go. Point number 1 about military conscription and national identity, for instance. This is our analysis. This is how it responded to the previous speaker's point on this. And then you have an explanation that fulfills a dual function. So no need to separate them together, especially because it can make you sound repetitive later in your speech. So that would be for points and integration between them, and no difference between arguments and responses. Inherently, they're the same thing. Best practice number 4 is about POIs. This is quite important because the recent trend in worlds really emphasizes on the importance of giving and taking POIs. Number 1 is the function of POIs. Usually there's 4 functions. Ideally, you across 2 speeches, you take 3 POIs. If it's not possible, at least 1 per speaker. That's the amount that we're going to really encourage all speakers to do in NUDC. Not taking a POI is not a sign of, it does not help you. So please do not take POIs. Please take 1, at least. If you can take 2, that's great. If you're an opening team, take at least 1 from the closing. Vice versa, if you're closing, take at least 1 from the opening. Ideally, 1 team takes 1 POI from an opening and 1 POI from the closing, just so that you can engage with everybody from the bench. If you're a closing team and you refuse to take any POIs from your opening, you can be seen as not able to engage with them. Same thing if you're an opening and then you're closing, the closing teams from asking anything to you. It will be seen as you not being brave enough to engage with your opponents. So it actually hurts your perception and your credibility as a speaker. The consequence of not taking POIs, it may flip the call on close calls, it may lower your speaker score, and it may reduce the margin of victory. So if previously you can win with 5 margins against the closest team to you, maybe then your margin should just be 2, simply because you don't want to take any POI. So you don't want to do that to yourself, right? Because you want to collect as many scores as possible. Please take POIs in order to show that you are ready and brave enough to engage. Now, how do you deliver an ideal POI? Number 1, maximum 15 seconds. Do not exceed this. Number 2, contrary to many beliefs, shorter POI is actually the better one, because immediately they have to answer long.
like the questions we often hear in debat-debat di TV, yeah, usually it will give the speaker a lot of time to think about what they can answer the question with. So the shorter is usually the better. Number 3, an ideal POI only has one idea. If a POI has 2 questions, the judge will pretend like the second question one idea in POI. Number 4, never waste your time in POIs by saying, so you said that blah, 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 blah. You repeat what they say for 10 seconds before you get to your question. This is very Indonesian, but please do not do that. Go directly to your question, because it doesn't necessarily help for you to explain to the speaker what they themselves say. Maybe that's not going to be helpful. Just go directly to your question. That makes it shorter. Yeah. Number 5, write your POIs down. You may want to sketch what sentence you exactly want to say, and be prepared, because some speaker will say, I want to take a POI now. Do you have it ready? And then you kind of like, okay, I'm not ready. And then you have to think about it on the fly. It's probably not going to be your best sentence. That's not going to be good. So please have a POI prepared. Write it down so that whenever you want to ask it, you're ready. And make sure you're ready to unmute as well when you're asked to deliver a POI, so that you don't have to sort of like fumble with all of the technical difficulties that make POIs not necessarily good. You literally have only 15 seconds, so be prepared. If opening, it is ideal that you ask questions that forces closing teams to talk about your case. So you may want to engage your case as an opening, but the more important thing is to drag them back to your case and making sure your case is something that is discussed. Don't tell your opening about your extension, because sometimes your opening can steal yours if they're smart. So be strategic in terms of the content of your POI as well, because many things can happen in POIs. And I think that's one of the beauties of PP. And finally, not answering a POI, for instance, saying that I will answer that later, or my next speaker will answer that, it will count as not taking a POI. So answer a POI promptly, directly, as good as you can, move on. Okay. All right. Those would be the 4 best practices to hopefully help you in NUDC. Now, the pitfalls to avoid, the common mistakes: not taking a POI or not answering POIs, bringing a dictionary definition. For instance, military means the people who goes and defend the country. Usually they wear uniform. In Indonesia, we call them TNI, and also ABRI, and then you have Angkatan Laut and all that kind of thing. This is not helpful for your case, because any average reasonable voter would know what military is. So probably a definition has to be more strategic than that. Don't waste your time on dictionary definitions that everybody should understand. Number 3, about separating rebuttals with arguments, sometimes can be quite dangerous if you make yourself repetitive. So you want to integrate them and making sure they're in the same theme. Number 4, arguing the wrong motion. As Devi has mentioned in the motion analysis earlier, make sure that your arguments are relevant to the motion. Number 5, making motions more specific than intended. As Devi mentioned earlier, if the motion is not about Indonesia, then the debate should not be about Indonesia. If the motion is not about specific countries, then it should not be about specific countries or specific regions. It has to match with the level of generality that is asked by the motion. If we, as the core adjudication panel, wants you to debate about Indonesia, we're going to say it in the motion. Okay? So assume that all motions are general unless the motion tells you otherwise. Number 6, not differentiating yourself with an opening theme is also common mistakes we see in NUDC. Closing theme will just repeat what is already heard in the opening theme, or would just say whatever it is that they think is important to say in the debate without the active strategy of differentiating themselves with their opening. Make sure you differentiate yourself with your opening. That's very, very, very important. Now, finally, a common mistake that we also see in various NUDCs is that when speakers force yourself to speak for 7 minutes, ending up only repeating yourself. There is no need to do this. You're not going to get extra points for simply reaching 7 minutes. We're not going to judge you on overtime, undertime, cannot. Yeah. So please avoid this at all costs. If your speech finishes at 6:50, it finishes at 6:50, it finishes at 6:30, it finishes at 6:30. My teammate's speech when we won NUDC finished at 6:40, and he had nothing else to say, and then he sat down, and that's completely fine, right? So debating is not about simply ticking the box. 7 minutes, okay, fine. 75, yeah, cannot. So you don't need to force yourself or speak for 7 minutes, but similarly, please do not go over time as well. Yeah, the speaking time is 7 minutes. Please heed that. After 7:15, the judges will not going to take any more notes. So please avoid these common mistakes. I think this will really be helpful. Finally, the last thing I want to talk when it comes to best practices are glossary. One thing we'd like to develop for NUDC 2021 is a live list of debating glossary. This means a list of terminologies or jargons that appear very frequently in debates, particularly by teams that are more exposed to maybe an international level of debating, or maybe judges, etc. This live list will be publicly accessible by teams. Hopefully, this list would be able to help all teams to understand their opponents, to find words to express their case in English, and most importantly, to understand judges' OA whenever the judge uses those terms. These are some of the terms that maybe can be helpful. Things like stance, which is your team's core vision. It can determine what sets of actions will be relevant for you and otherwise. Framing means the active effort to strategically position yourself in a way that's beneficial for you. Framing out other teams means making sure that they sound less important compared to you. Counterfactual means the opposite of your policy. For example, if you'd like to apply a new policy, then the counterfactual is a different policy or status quo, something different. Yeah. After the status quo, it means the current condition. Delta, it usually means difference, usually in extent. For example, the policy's implementation will be very problematic so that the benefit is very small, leading to low delta with status quo. Artinya bedanya nggak terlalu jauh gitu ya. But bahasa-bahasa debate sekarang delta gitu. So I think this can be very useful if you want to use it. And whenever you hear that word, you already know what it means. And finally, metric. Metric is yardsticks with which you gauge changes, threshold of success, etc. For instance, the metric of success in a democracy is inclusivity. So if inclusivity is not achieved, democracy is not successful. That can be a kind of example of how to use metric. We're going to update the debating glossary as we go. So let's just see how it goes. Finally, technicalities and feedback, just to close the seminar. All right. First and foremost, on general conduct, please be polite. All equity rules apply. Please do not harass anybody. Please do not curse. Please do not generalize or otherize protected attributes. Protected attributes can mean race, religion, ethnicity, disability status, any kind of gender, yeah. Do not make generalizations or authorizations. Very, very important. When you make someone uncomfortable, it's okay, because this is also a learning experience for everybody. Just apologize swiftly and sincerely whenever you make these mistakes, yeah. Just so that we can be polite and nice to each other. It's not nice to make others feel uncomfortable, especially regarding things that they cannot change. Remember that you're representing your university and this is an event. By Pois, while it is virtual, the usual level of decorum and appropriateness is expected and demanded. You're also asked to wear your alma mater jacket. If not possible, wear something presentable and decent. Yeah, just like as you would if you attend the normal events that are formal, events that are held by the government. In terms of general conduct, Pois has the authority to observe and also record any room that they believe is relevant. Yeah, so there will not be any policies of inquiring consent from participants when it comes to recording. This event is going to be held by Pois, and therefore this authority prevails. This will be the general conduct. More on that later as we go. Specifically about debating in Zoom, first and foremost, as Devi has mentioned, please use your own timer in order to make sure you're not going over time, in order for you to know when POIs can be offered by the opposing bench, and also when POIs should stop be proposed by the opposing bench. You can use your own timer to time other people's speeches as well. Number two, please respect the POI preferences of the speaking speaker. Sometimes some speaker prefers POIs to be offered to them in a verbal way. Yeah, so that you will unmute and say POI, ma'am, POI speaker, something like that. But other speakers prefer POIs to be asked in the chat, so almost like in a seminar. Whatever the speaker prefers, please respect that. And please make sure that you only offer POIs in the way that the speaker is comfortable with. And speakers, please indicate your POI preferences. And then connection can be bad, so please prepare a backup connection. Sometimes backup connection does not work and will fail. So please be prepared to call your friend over WhatsApp or landline for emergencies. Sometimes you can phone your friend and then your friend can put the phone on their microphone so that the debate can still happen. Just be prepared of these kind of contingencies. And also double and triple check your audio devices. Sometimes it may sound choppy. Sometimes it may sound not clear or low level volume, all of those things. Maybe it's a problem with the headset. You want to double check and triple check just to ensure your speech is not necessarily made less comfortable simply because all of these technicalities, which matters, trust me, it happens a lot, which we're going to see tomorrow in the dummy round. Yeah, but make sure you double and triple check your audio devices just to avoid things that you don't want to happen, because literally this is an opportunity that's quite big. So make sure it's not technicality that tackles you down. If possible, turn on your video while speaking. That's very encouraged, but only if possible. Certainly there's going to be connection issues that prevent you to do that, but that's okay as well. But if you can, please turn on your video. Mute yourself when not speaking is very, very important as well. Do not be away from keyboard. Sometimes after a speaker stops speaking, they turn off their video and then they kind of wander out, whatever. And then when the judges are ready to deliberate, these speakers still hang around in the room, stuff like that. Not good. Okay, make sure the device is still close with you. You know what's going on at all times. Don't be away from keyboard for too long, just to ensure if there's any developments, you know what is going on. Finally, please read Iqra, yeah? Read the tech guide. Very, 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 very important, just to make sure that we avoid all technical difficulties, which can be quite tricky. What is Discord? What is Zoom? How do you get into breakout rooms? How do you get out of breakout rooms? What is building manager? Stuff that the tech team will talk about in the later briefing. Please read the guide. It's very, very important. All right. The last thing I want to talk about is expectation from adjudicators. As Devi has mentioned, judges will not assess you based on English fluency, accent, grammar, precision, speed, intonation, etc. They will not assess you based on overtime or undertime. If you is that because you lose some time that you can use to develop your arguments, but you're not going to get automatic under 75 if you go under time. It doesn't make any sense, because this is not, it's not a timer contest. Yeah, it's basically how much logic you develop in 6 minutes and in whatever time you spend your time. So they will not assess you based on this. Also, judges won't assess how much facts you know either, because it's not a paper writing competition. It all boils down to logic. So please be ready with this kind of expectation from your judges. The judges will assess the logical quality of your arguments, as what we've described earlier in best practices, etc., how it relates with emotion, how it relates with robustness inherently of these specific arguments, and how you compare yourself with other teams, those three burdens. Judges also will not be required to provide you with general or specific inputs or feedback during their OA. Yeah, they're not there to coach you, they're there to judge you. They're they will only or mostly provide comparisons between teams in their OA. If you want further feedback or inputs or constructives or things that the judge think that they can contribute to your case as an input, you can do that. Feel free, and feel free, by the way, means optional. Yeah, feel free to ask your judges, but please do so very, very kindly. Do not do that in a way that's confrontational. Be patient with your judges as well, because judges have been patient in terms of listening to the debate for almost an hour. So I think the same level of decency can be awarded to them as well. However, judges will be asked to explicitly compare your team with others. This may come across as harsh at times, so please have the patience to listen to what they say. The reason why this is all important is because feedback is going to be required. You will have to score your judge after their OA or reasons for decision. This is required to give us a better tracking of judges' performance. It's very, very important. So please submit feedbacks. Yeah, please spare a bit of time to submit your feedback. However, in terms of submitting your feedback, do not base it on subjectivity. Because I get fourth, the judge is bad, or because I get fourth, maximum 6 lah, the judges, yeah, because I don't like getting fourth. Cannot. Please do not base the score based on your feelings regarding the results, because the judges may have feelings about your case as well, but they cannot give you score based on those feelings. So same thing applies when it comes to you and your judges. Instead, please read the UDC 2020 Astana Chair Scale. We will share that later in Discord. The scale is 1 to 10. 1 means official complaint, incomprehensible, does not make any sense at all, maybe did not talk much at all, very little. 10, however, does not mean perfect. It's not Ilahi Rabbi, yeah, it's not God. Yeah, 10 just means a very comprehensive OA that tackles most, if not all, of the important materials in the debate and justifies all the comparisons between teams with great clarity. So again, it's not a perfect OA, because we have a perception that maybe 10 is like, in tests or di ulangan gitu ya, 10 is perfect, gitu, nothing wrong, but that's not the case with OA and feedback. In a nutshell, this is what it means. When providing feedback, use this scale. You can read it later. We will provide that in Discord as well. Finally, the most important thing to close this debating seminar, learn something from NUDC 2021. Hopefully you can take away a thing or two. Make new friends. I think this is really important as well. Have fun. We're going to present you with fun stuff, so make sure you don't lose the joy and magic and fun of debating. So feel free to explore yourself as much as possible. And most importantly, since this is pandemic, it is very, 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 very important to stay safe and physically and mentally healthy above all other things. At the end of the day, debating is debating. Competitions are competitions. Life and your physique and your mental health, your sanity is still very, very important as well. So that has to take priority over everything else. We would really like to encourage everybody to make sure that you do all that you can in order to stay safe in these difficult times, making sure that you're physically fit, making sure that you're also mentally as engaged as possible. And whenever you have issues with these things, do not hesitate to let people around you know. Okay, these are the 4 things that are important amongst everything else, and that marks the end of the debating seminar. Thank you very much for your attention. So I think now we can move on the question and answer. All right, I think the first question we have, and I think Diffie, if you want to turn on your video and then we can sort of like answer the question, more than happy to do so as well. Jane, Zudi, and Akbar, whenever you'd like to jump in, feel free to do so as well. But the first question will be, in a bubble room where debate teams are strong, opinions can be quite difficult to determine the ranks. What should the panel do? The answer to that would be, there is no difference between whatever rooms you're judging. Either you're judging a bubble room, a room with low points, a grand final, a preliminary round, whatever. Judging is judging is judging. It's the same, right? if there's difficulties in terms of making comparisons between different teams, then do a lot of things that later Zuti and Akbar will talk about. Maybe things like take more notes, maybe expose yourself to, because there's still one more month approximately till NUDC. So maybe you want to look at debating videos and kind of crank up the speed of that video. So not just one time play, yeah, maybe 1.5 or 2. And this is really helpful in order to make sure you're accustomed to listening to people in high speed and you're still able to get the points that they're saying. And then you're going to be able to sort of be more familiar with high speed speeches. And this can equip you and prepare you better to handle speeches that are more dense in quality and more loaded with more materials like the likes of these rooms. But so I think these are the kind of preparations. But I mean, I think Sudi and Akbar will talk about that later on. But make sure you don't come with the approach that, hey, I'm judging a different type of room, so I need to be more attuned, I need to pay more attention. That can be dangerous because it means that you're going to be less paying attention if you feel the room is not as important. And this is not the kind of thing that we'd like to encourage, because all rooms are important. Everyone is dedicating energy, time, efforts, thoughts, care, discipline into whatever efforts that they bring into debating. So please make sure that you judge rooms the way that they're supposed to be judged without differences. And sometimes biases can kick in as well, right, in determining what rooms are more important than others. Maybe it's based on what institution, maybe it's based on reputation, geography, whatever. And that's not a good thing because it's bias at the end of the day. So let's not do that. All rooms are equally important. You approach it the same way. In order for you to be able to navigate on more difficult speeches, just get accustomed to them. Okay. All right. Is there any other addition from the other Ajcore on that?
No, from.
All right. 1 second. All right. So the next question for fiat. Can we say that our proposal has no side effect or harm? For example, the motion about tech that allows us to preserve our consciousness, can we create a setup where this tech didn't give any side effects or harm towards the one who will be put inside it? The answer is this. If you are allowed to not talk about certain harms by fiat, usually the motion will let you know. Usually there will be an information slide that tells you these are not the kind of things that ought to be debated and all that kind of things, yeah? So make sure you rely on information slides, especially in more complicated motions like what your example brings. Number two, usually opposition is allowed to undermine the urgency from government as a form of response, different than challenging proposition fiat, which makes the proposal undebatable. Yeah, so clarify prop fiat. So the example of prop fiat usually is with regard to whether or not the motion will pass or not. For instance, this house would teach atheism in schools. Yeah, and then opposition team says, you cannot pass this in the Congress. Nobody in the Congress will agree on that because a lot of people in the Congress are religious. And then this will create political backlash if you try to propose it. You cannot use that because by fiat, propositions out of the House is allowed to assume that the motion will pass. I think that's a better example of fiat. Okay, so if you're going to say that the policy will be assumed to be perfect, that's a rather dangerous area. I don't think you can make immediate assumptions with regards to whether or not some policies or some technologies will be bulletproof. Okay, and if we're going to allow you to make that assumption, we're going to let you know. We're going to think about it. If you're not allowed by the motion to make these assumptions, probably then it's fair game. Probably you don't have to forget to say that. That's all I'm saying. Okay. So hopefully that answers that question. Good. Next, Devi, do you have any addition to that?
No, it's already clear.
Oh, wonderful. Next, if a speaker rejected a POI after another speaker repeatedly asked for POI, will the adjudicators warn the speaker to take the POI? No, absolutely not. The speaker is in full control of their speech whenever they're speaking. If you want to take a POI, you take a POI. If you don't want to take it, then you don't want to take it. The adjudicator will simply assess. If the speaker does not take a POI, then maybe that hurts their possibility of engaging. Okay? So sometimes as a speaker, you may feel insecurity. Why is my POI not taken? That's not fair, all of those things. Have faith in your adjudicators. Okay, adjudicators will actually note speakers who are not taking any POIs. So let's say 6 minutes and 40 your POIs have not been taken at all, and you've proposed 15 different POIs throughout the speech. Yeah, none is taken. Okay, lah, fine. You sit down. Nice, because then the judges will have to take note on that. If the judges don't take note, then you can ask the judge about that. Why didn't you take into account the fact they reject all my POI offers? All of those things. Okay, so it's not on you. It's on the judges and on the speaker. Don't be insecure. That should be fine. Cool. Next question. Will there be a score reduction for a team that misinterpreted their opponent's arguments because of technical hindrance, because they cannot hear the opponent's voice due to connection problem or hardware problem as such? The answers will be this. If you feel there is a technical issue, let your chair, let the head judge in your room know via chat. Okay, the chair will then navigate the situation, and this is an important role of chairing a Zoom debate as well, because chairs need to be the one who decides whether or not the speaker is audible. Because if the speaker is audible for everybody else in the panel of adjudication, and you're the only one who cannot hear as a speaker, maybe it's on your end, not on everybody, not on the speaker's end. So there will not be any sort of score that is reduced or anything like that. If you sense a technical difficulties, let your chair know. Yeah, it does not go into the area of scoring technical difficulties. But most importantly, it is important to note that there will be varying types and degrees of technical capacities. Yeah, sometimes some audio can be quite choppy. Sometimes it can be faint. Sometimes it can be, you know, kasak-kasak. Yeah, many other kind of types that you will encounter. It is also required for you as a speaker to please be patient. Just because there is a little bit of a missing thing in Zoom, maybe 2 seconds drop, that's usually okay, because if it picks up again quickly, then no problem. If there's a little bit of a difficulty, it's not a technical failure. You also must make the effort of listening as best as possible to what the speaker is conveying, because that's just nice to do that. Okay, so do those 2 things. First and foremost, make the effort of listening to the speaker as much as possible. If you literally cannot listen to the speaker, then number 2, tell your chair in the room, and then the chair will navigate accordingly and check. Yeah. All right. Cool. The next question. I was pressing on the importance of taking POIs or answering it. What about giving them? Sure, it has some points, but what if a contestant doesn't give POI but they answer them? Can that still be considered as not engaging in the debate? Thank you. Yes, absolutely. If you don't offer any POIs, chairs will also take note that you're not offering any POIs as a team. That's also not good, specifically if you're opening, yeah, and then the closing team has been yapping about punching and responding to your case like crazy, and then you just sit down there nicely. That's not ideal. So as much as possible, just try to offer POIs, just to ensure that you're still engaged in the room, engaged in the debate, and show your engagement. That's also very, very important. So it gives an impression to your judges that you're still engaged. And if your closing teams are quite savage compared to you, then at least you have an opportunity of response if they take one of your POI. So that's something, that's an effort, that's an attempt to respond as opposed to nothing at all. So even though you don't think your POIs can be good, even though you're not confident or anything like that, just be confident. At least trying can lead you somewhere as opposed to not trying at all. Ya, jadinya dicoba saja. Mudah-mudahan bisa. Gitu.
Kak, before we continue, I think we skip one question from above. The question is about the motion specifications. If we use one country as a certain example, is that allowed, or we should use more than one country? For these questions, I think that in terms of example, there are no limit upon how many countries that you want to bring as an example.
Do you want to answer that, Devi?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to answer it a bit. Okay, for these questions, I think that we are not having limit upon how many examples that you could bring in the debate, as long as it is within still relevant with the motions and you are not overboard with the example that you try to bring. Sometimes that speakers tend to forget that just because you throw example does not necessarily means we will take any explanation at the face front. You have to explain why does your example relevant and why does this example are likely to happen in the scenario that you try to present in the debate and such. So yeah, example is good and you can bring as many examples as possible, but please do not forget to explain a step-by-step analysis. Why does your example matter in these aspects? Yeah, I think that's the questions that we missed. I think we can continue for the next questions. Yeah. Oh, wait.
Absolutely. So I think the next question is, what happened if the opening bench has different understanding about the motion? How do you win this debate? So number one, the AdJuCorps will do our best to make sure that the motions are clear and not subject to misunderstanding. That's very important. Debaters, if you're not sure about the wording, we'll open a question and answer session at Discord in a written format. So don't ask your questions verbally to us, ask them in written form. The reason why this is important is that if it is written, everyone can know what question is asked and what clarifications are made by the AdJuCorps on that motion clarification channel in Discord. Yeah, so there will be a specific section in Discord that you can use in order to ask clarifications about the motion. Anytime in your case building, you can check that in order to see what clarifications, if any, have been made. And this can improve everybody in the tournament's understanding. The reason why we don't want to do this verbally is that if it is verbally, some teams can miss it because they already run away preparing, because they're already all of those things, and then key explanations can be missed. That's why we want it all to be written so that it's much more easy. So if you're not sure, you can definitely ask questions and the wording will be clear. However, if it still happens that your opening team brings a different interpretation of the motion, and then you're stuck in a closing team, which can be quite a pickly situation, isn't it? It can be quite difficult. What you can do is that this is the tricky part of BP, and this is the art part of BP. You can try to correct it without knifing your opening. So be as elegant as possible when it comes to how do you address it, how do you make sure you still sound consistent with your opening, but you make the necessary corrections with your motions. Okay, an example of this would be, there was a debate in which torture was not, it was a debate about whether or not we should legalize torture as ways of collecting information. And then I was supposed to be the team that legalized torture. My opening suddenly talks about not legalizing torture. So I'm like, this is crazy. They talk about the political aspects of why not legalizing torture is good and all that kind of thing. So as a closing team, what I did was I said, okay, so in legalization of torture, there's two aspects. There's a political discussion that happens in the Congress and president, whatever. And number two, there's direct aspects, right? How you collect information, what you apply in the military, in the war zones, all of those things. My opening team has talked about the political aspect, which is great. Whatever they want to talk about it, fantastic. Our extension will talk about a different aspect, which is how does it apply on the ground, the practical aspects. We're going to talk about why the practical aspect of collecting data from torture is good. So technically, I'm arguing a different case than my opening. Maybe it's not as consistent as ever, but the wording makes it sound as if you're trying to save their face as well. So I think this is a tricky part of BP. So you can find creative ways in which you kind of slap your opening a little bit, but not in a way that's direct, not in a way that's as barbaric as that. Just be elegant about it, I think, would be a good way to sort of go about it, because it can be quite a pickly situation. But I think this is also the art of BP, I think. So I hope that answers your question. I'm sorry for getting on a roundabout, nostalgic way about it, but it's a good question. Yeah.
Can I just add? Sorry, guys,
Absolutely.
I'm not gonna turn on my camera because the connection is bad. Hi. So because there are several questions regarding to what will happen, what should happen if the Prime Minister or the opening team sets a wrong explanation of the motion. So there are a couple of ways in which this could go. There are times in which the debate has to change completely. For example, if the motion says this House sets a minimum quota for, let's say, indigenous students in universities. This happened, I think, a couple of times where the opening government mistook minimum quota instead of a certain percentage for people of indigenous communities in universities. They said we're going to limit because, dalam tanda kutip minimum quota. So this is why we also encourage teams to answer questions, ask questions regarding to motion wordings if you are not clear, or at least you're doubtful of its understanding. However, in cases where this debate happens, it is sometimes necessary for oppositions or closing to completely flip their case in the middle just to make sure the debate run, because sometimes both Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister insist on that definition. So just make sure that the debate can actually go. So that can happen. So be prepared for that. Again, this is one of the arts of BP. We highly encourage everyone to be prepared on these type of scenarios. There are also, in regards to UP's elegant way of not really trying not to challenge or trying not to be too offensive in correcting mistakes. There was a debate that talked about this House would limit capital for political parties to campaign. The setup or the definition set by the Prime Minister was political parties as in actual parties, like birthday parties. Now, obviously, that is not what the I see you, Upi. That was not what the debate asked for. But fortunately, the opposition is able to state that we don't think that this is what the debate wanted. We think this goes far beyond just setting up parties. We think this all talks about the campaign as a whole. And also, fortunately enough, the Deputy Prime Minister went along with that correct definition, because there is a question about what would happen, what should Deputy Prime Minister do if your Prime Minister or is your team set up a wrong proposal. I'm gonna answer this di sini biar kita nggak ngulang-ngulang ya, guys. If you will be strategic, guys, if you believe that your definition is wrong and you're probably going to be left out of the debate because of it, we think that it might be more strategic for your team to follow the correct definition and make arguments accordingly. But again, this is be strategic and make sure that if you don't understand the wording of the mission, please ask the question before the debate start, so we make sure that these things are can be avoided in the debate, to have an equal fair chance for your team to win as well as opening government. Ito siyang that's what I want to add. Thank you, Yapi, for the time.
No, absolutely. I think that's a really, really good way of approaching it as well. So definitely. Cool. So in that case, I think we can move to the last two questions questions, or three. Okay, the next question says as follows: in terms to engage with the comparison, are there any ideas of how to find or seek better counterfactual? Where to begin the analysis of finding counterfactual? Because I still kind of confused to whether counterfactual refers as a bad impact or what will happen on the other side. Okay, so the answer to that is this. A counterfactual basically is other things that is different from what you are going to do. For instance, if your stance is to support military conscription, to have, let's say, to develop national identity, maybe the counterfactual to that would be developing national identity using other types of things beside military conscription, like education, like formal education in schools, informal education by families, or maybe you want to talk about political parties. Maybe you want to talk about Karang Taruna, right? Or youth activities, YMCA, things like that. These are counterfactuals because it doesn't mean that when you do military conscription, all of these things will be done as well. These things can happen in different worlds. That's why it's important to identify the counterfactual because of that, yeah? So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad impact or anything like that. Bad impact is not a counterfactual. It's simply a response to what the speaker has said when it comes to how do we get certain benefits or harms from, from what they want to say. So it's usually a negation more than a counterfactual. A counterfactual is simply to say, we have better way of doing things, or other things exist in the society in order to make sure that we can get your benefit too. So it doesn't have to come from your benefit because the counterfactual is better. Or in the counterfactual, it's probably necessarily worse or anything like that. So you want to talk about that as well, if that makes sense. Yeah. So if in terms of how do you find the counterfactual, simply just think about if this policy is done, what other things exist in the society? If it's a military conscription, then probably you want to think about what the world looks like without military conscription and make the comparison between this is a world with military conscription, this is what you're going to get, this is what you're going to lose. This is a world without military conscription, this is what you're going to get on our side and this is better. This is where you're going to lose from their side, and this is better too. Here's why. That's how you do counterfactuals. In Devi's example about academic tracking means kelas unggulan ya, itu in simple Indonesian terms. Then you also do that. Academic tracking means sekolah-sekolah yang ada kelas unggulannya, sekolah-sekolah elit gitu kan. And then in the world, in the counterfactual, probably you're not going to have these high-performing classes, low-performing classes, etc. All of the classes will be mixed. Here's what we're going to get. Gitu. So that's basically how you do counterfactuals, making sure you explain their world and your world, which is different. Okay, I think that's the simplest way to explain it. I think the non-jargon terms to talk about counterfactual would be your world, my world, their world, our world. Here's the difference between the two. Here's why we're better. Here's why they're worse. Something like that. Okay. All right. Next question. Seberapa penting, signifikan, atau berpengaruh pada argumenkah evidence dan contoh kasus yang benar ada atau terjadi? Bila saat debat tidak bisa provide evidence demikian, apakah ada saran? Terima kasih. Okay, so as I've mentioned earlier, debating is not necessarily a fact contest. Yeah. It's a contest about logic. That's why evidences, case studies, facts will only be important to support premises, not to replace premises. If you have the premises and the logical explanation as to why things happen, that should be enough. You don't have examples, that's completely fine. Okay, if you have example, it's good, but it's supportive in terms of its role, not a must. If it's a must, then probably it's a different kind of activity. And this is also standards that we are using in worlds juga gitu loh. I mean, I think that many debates that we see in worlds really heavily focus more on the premises of the arguments. For instance, if you say military conscription will lead towards better formation of national identity, common national identity, then I don't think I need that much of an explanation about the NE, about South Korea with their military conscription. Maybe you want to talk about, Jungkook and all of the BTS members who's done military conscription, whatever. That's helpful, but not a must, yeah? Or Singapore maybe is an example that's good, but not a must. What we need more is an explanation. What does military conscription look like? How do you actually get from what military conscription look like in that description into the benefits that you claim, right? Because then all of the things that we've mentioned in the example before in the slide about argument-based practices. That's why that part of an explanation, which is not depending on example, is more important than simply evidences or anything like that. Because at the end of the day, it's a 15 minutes case building, and you're not supposed to research for evidence. So it could be quite weird if you're starting to cite various kind of research sources or whatever. It's like, where do you get that from? It's kind of weird, right? So that's why ultimately debating is not necessarily judged on how much evidence you can bring and how much data or facts you can sort of spell out of your mouth, because it's important, but the premise is more important. The logical explanation of the premise is more important. Okay, good. Note that context also affects your scoring, but it is in terms of how much the debate depends on contextualization. I mean, certainly in a debate about China, if you can tell us more about China based on researches that you've done about China, it would be helpful. If you want to talk about Russia, or if you want to talk about, last year's motion about NU and Muhammadiyah, the more you know about these organizations, the more helpful it becomes for you. But then these are not treated as evidence. These are simply treated as you explaining the understanding about real life actors, explain the characters of those actors, not necessarily an evidence of your premise being true. Okay, begitulah jadinya. So simple logic works. Yeah. Next, can the speaker interrupt POI if the person who's offering POI speaks more than 15 seconds? Yes. If it's more than 15 seconds, you can cut them off. 15 seconds already done, finish. But if don't cut them off before 15 seconds. Okay. What constitutes as knifing my opening? This is already discussed in the seminar. Make sure you have a consistent stance between your opening and your closing. If your opening stance is to fully support the motion, then probably you have to go along with that. Fully supported, you probably want to go along with that. If your opening says, oh, we want to talk about a global debate, everybody's involved, maybe you want to go along with that. If your opening wants to sets the debate in the development, that kind of thing, yeah. Just make sure the stance is consistent. It's just the reason to support the stance should be different. Okay, that would be what knifing constitutes. All right. Basically, that would be it. I think that ends the question and answer session. I think we've already run out of time. If there are any further questions, please put them in the G form. We'll try to answer them accordingly, and we'll share them in Discord. So thank you very much for sparing your time listening to us. Hopefully these can be helpful in terms of making sure that you debate mostly, but also judge as good as possible in order to equip yourself with the ability of judging and what you can expect from judges. I'm passing it over to Akbar and Zudi to continue with the adjudication seminar. Once again, good luck for the preparations. Thank you very much. See you around.
Hi guys.